Welcome to Popcorn Psychology, the podcast where we watch blockbuster movies and psychoanalyze them. My name is Brittany Brownfield, and I'm a child therapist, and I'm joined by
Ben Stover, individual therapist.
Hannah Espinoza, marriage and family therapist.
We are all licensed clinical professional counselors, also known as therapists, who practice out of Chicago. Even though we are licensed mental health professionals, this podcast is purely for entertainment purposes and to fulfill our love of dissecting pop culture in all forms.
Please remember that even though we are all licensed therapists, we aren't your therapist.
If you are struggling with mental health symptoms, please find a local mental health provider.
Hi. So on today's episode, we actually have two special guests, Dr. Dave Paltin and Andrew Rubin from Symptom Media. So to do some quick introductions, Dr. Dave Paltin is a clinical psychologist who has taught therapy and diagnostic assessment for the past 25 years and has a private therapy practice in Orange, California. He's wrote articles and books on topics such as violence prediction and pediatric psychology. He frequently consults with public agencies and schools on what he calls leveling the playing field for students with autism and ADHD. But the most important experience to him has been helping his two children thrive and survive to adulthood. And Andrew Rubin is president and co-founder of Symptom Media, manages all aspects of Symptom Media's marketing and content creation operations. In addition to his role as president, Andrew lends his screenwriting, directing, and editing services to Symptom Media, where he works with subject matter experts such as psychiatric mental health nurses, psychologists, psychiatrists, and social workers in all aspects of film production that has resulted in over 1,000 films produced. Andrew attended New York University's Tisch School for the Arts for Film Production, has written numerous screenplays for professional production companies in Hollywood, and is a member of the Writers Guild of America. Woo. All right, so Andrew, I'll throw it to you if you want to talk a little bit about Symptom Media.
Yeah, thank you. So Symptom Media was actually founded about 10 years ago now as a collaboration between filmmakers and mental health experts. Our founding partner, Dr. Don Fiedler, is a psychiatrist out of West Virginia University. And it actually kind of came out of his brainchild. He teaches acting and psychiatry and playwriting. So what we do is we've created all these simulations. They're based on the DSM-5 and ICD-10 video case studies with actors portraying different mental health diagnoses. Sort of unlike Hollywood, we sort of do the reverse, where we actually work with our behavioral health experts and they lead the process. So what they say goes to make the most realistic portrayals that really can help with diagnosing, building empathy, and showing different disorders that many people may not get a chance to see clinically, sometimes for years. So we've created this entire film library that's streaming online of these video case studies, as well as assessment tools such as suicide assessments, mental status exams. And we've recently started offering continuing education courses, partnering with instructors like Dr. Paltin coming in to analyze our films and break down the disorders with the symptoms. And so Symptom Media, we're a whole resource for mental health education.
We're also offering Popcorn Psychology listeners a special 25% off to Symptom Media right now. So that's 25% off of all of our individual subscription plans that range from 4 months, 6 months, 1 year to 3 years. All you have to do is enter in Popcorn Psych, the discount Popcorn Psych, no caps, all one word when you're checking out. And what that gives you access to when you're subscribing to Symptom Media is all of our over 600 video case studies in our library, as well as our assessment tools, test section videos, our entire collection of ANCC and ACCME accredited courses, and then as well as all of our new releases. So all new releases in films and courses while you're a subscriber. So again, that's 25% off for everyone. And again, the code is Popcorn Psych. So just head to symptommedia.com. You can check out previews of our films and courses. And we're just so thrilled to be here on Popcorn Psychology. So check us out, symptommedia.com.
Thank you. That's such a great resource that is, sometimes lacking within our field of, I think we all, if you go to school for psychology, counseling, whatever, you will have to watch at one point or another some no offense, some pretty awkward simulations of people doing therapy. So I like that that's this resource available to showcase that in hopefully slightly more meaningful, entertaining ways, but also really gets across. And I like that you work with so many professionals in the field, including Dr. Paltin, to kind of make sure that this is showing something worthwhile.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We're well aware of what's been done in the past and what people have had to endure, maybe. So we try to really make things that are engaging, entertaining, but not in an exploitive way. That really just sort of exemplify a diagnosis. And so, anybody can subscribe and have access to the entire film library of all these videos to dive in, as well as sort of some new simulation activities that we're putting together, as well as our accredited courses. But we really try to find ways to make these as dynamic and real as possible. One of the courses we did with Dave was on depression induced opioid disorder. Or I think I said that backwards, but
a lot of those words together. But it does give you a very structured, controlled kind of presentation of a particular diagnosis or disorder. And so in training or for training purposes, that's really crucial to be able to tease out those symptoms through analyzing that kind of case study. So it really works well.
Yeah. So someone that is a filmmaker at heart and a screenwriter, I know the power of movies, and obviously I think that's such a direct way of getting to the heart of understanding another person. So obviously I just felt, you guys do such a wonderful job breaking down films and, teasing out what is real and what's sometimes very not real. So anyways, I think it's an interesting sort of adjacent discussion that you guys do with what we do every day at Symptom Media.
Thank you. I appreciate hearing that from someone who's on a mission that's very similar to ours. So we're thrilled to have both of you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for inviting us. Definitely. Yes.
So Dr. Paltin, tell us a little bit about your history, what you do, your practice. And I know we gave the brief rundown, but let's let our listeners get a chance to get to know you too, because they know us pretty well.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm glad to say that even after 25 years, 30 years of practice, I still think I have the best job in the world. Because I get to sit down with people and have meaningful interactions and talk about things that are really relevant and personal and important, and also get to do things like teaching and writing and trying to do public advocacy and those sorts of things. So those are all really, really enjoyable activities that I've been doing over the years. And then I think I mentioned to you before the podcast, I have a couple of kids. One of those sons was on the spectrum, or is on the spectrum. He's still around. He's 24 years old. He's doing great, living independently on the East Coast, and so it's just been a really interesting experience to go through things from a parent's subjective standpoint. Some of the types of issues that I've worked with objectively in my therapy practice. So it gives you a whole different appreciation for what people go through.
It certainly does. When you live with the very things you're trying to treat in your house and then realizing that the interventions you propose that research says work don't always work, especially when, you as a person, not as a practitioner, are trying to apply them, and you live through that frustration of what I'm being told and what I know works isn't working right now. And struggling through that to find the right formula that works for your family, for people in your life at that time is really, really important.
Yeah, those things rarely work. So it turns out, when you try and do them at home in your own family, it doesn't work out quite as well as in the textbooks. But I think overall, my general approach was eventually to try and find the brilliance in my kids, and especially my son who's neurodiverse. And that really worked. That worked well.
So having this film that we're going to talk about today, I think is probably a really important topic for us to cover. And not only is it having lived that experience, but also working with it professionally. I think that's going to be a really valuable addition to that episode. So I'm excited to have both of you on to have the perspective of both a filmmaker and writer and a psychologist and parent.
Happy to be here. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just throw in there the just sort of interesting synchronicity how Dave and I met and wound up collaborating together, which was we had cast his other son, who is a terrifically talented actor, in our autism spectrum disorder series. So his son was playing the role, and Dave and his wife came on set, as we do with any actor that is, an adolescent. And of course, his son blew us away, and we didn't realize how close the connection was to autism spectrum disorder when working with them. And so that experience was just invaluable. We spent the day. I guess there's a certain play aspect whenever you're doing acting and filming, which is, I think it was just immensely enjoyable, but probably exhausting for Ari, your son, as we went through the process. But
he's got 2 psychologists for parents, so I think every day it's exhausting in sort of a psychological way for him.
Yeah, I'm certain. So today we're going to be talking about Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, which, with this year being the 20th anniversary of September 11th, felt like a really important time to cover this movie, and especially with Dr. Paltin and Andrew available to us to collaborate on this episode. This anniversary is going to remind us what's been a dominant event in the lives of many of us, particularly those of us who are of the millennial generation. The morning of September 11th has defined the majority of our life. It has defined the economics, the war that has gone on and is still going on. It has been a dominant starting point for us, for our lives from that day forward. And to be taking a look at this event from a more individualized standpoint, as opposed to it being one of those flashpoint moments that we can all think back on and know exactly where we were when it happened. When we were in school, we were told about moments like this, and they used the day Reagan got shot or the day Kennedy got shot to illustrate it. But for our generation, the morning of September 11th, what happened where you were when the planes hit the towers has become that flashpoint memory to recognize a collective trauma when all of us as a nation, as a world, went through something that changed the course of everyone's history. And today we are going to cover this film starring Tom Hanks and Sandra Bullock, and this wonderful child actor that portrayed autism spectrum disorder so well.
So as we mentioned, today we're going to talk about Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, a movie that came out around 10 years ago. That is from sort of mostly from the perspective of a 10-year-old boy named Oskar, who they sort of briefly insinuate, well, they don't insinuate, they say he was evaluated for autism, but it came back, I think they said, like inconclusive. But we go through this movie with the presumption that he is somewhat on the autism spectrum. And he has a father who passed away in the 9/11 attacks the year before. So the movie sort of follows Oskar around as he tries to deal with the grief of his father by participating in a sort of quest to find the lock for a key that he found amongst his father's things. So today we are going to be talking about autism spectrum disorder, sort of the diagnostic criteria, how it's portrayed in the movie, sort of the facts and fictions of it. And we're also going to be talking about, similar to what we just talked about with WandaVision, grief, and not just grief though, but kind of the shame that can come along with grief, how relationships are impacted by grief, especially him and his mother. And we're also going to talk about collective grief as he experiences something, 9/11, which a lot all of America at the time was also feeling that, either from a personal level or from a collective level. So, and as always, we'll do treatment and final thoughts. So we'll start from the beginning, a very good place to start. So Ben, if you would like to maybe give a brief sort of like definitive discussion around what autism spectrum disorder is based on the DSM.
Sure. So I'll cover the DSM-5 criteria of autism spectrum disorder. When DSM-5 came out, the diagnosis that Oskar says that he was evaluated for was Asperger's disorder, and that is a term that is still pretty commonly used by the public, but it is no longer a diagnostic term. And everything that would have covered where Asperger's disorder was a previous diagnosis is now included in a spectrum for autism spectrum disorder. So what would have been called Asperger's in the past would now all be called autism spectrum disorder, and Asperger's would be on the higher functioning end of that, where someone has some social deficits, some processing differences, and has some different ways of understanding the world than your neurotypical person might, but does not show any of the more significant impairments that being diagnosed with autism can cause. Living with any sort of autistic diagnosis can cause people. So what we're going to talk about is what you're looking for. Criterion A of autism spectrum disorder is persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts, as manifested by several criteria, which I encourage you all to look up. But what you're going to see typically is difficulty in showing reciprocity, some deficits in nonverbal communication, and difficulty maintaining, developing, and operating within the context of a typical interpersonal relationship. Some of the other things you'll see, criterion B is restricted, repetitive patterns of behaviors, interests, or activities, manifested by several criteria that can include stereotypical or repetitive movements, insistence on the sameness and inflexibility, highly restricted, fixated interests that are either abnormal in intensity or focus, or hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input. And again, these go into much more detail if you actually would take a look at the DSM-5 criteria, which I encourage you to do. If you have questions, we're giving you a quick rundown here. But the criterion C that's really important to understand is that symptoms must be present in the early developmental period, but may not become fully manifested until social demands exceed limited capabilities or may be masked by strategies in later life. What that is saying is that we need to see some of these markers developing throughout childhood, but then you start to see where societal demands and the continued development of peers start to exceed the capabilities that a person has. And to manage a relationship, what would be typical for a 3-year-old to engage with would not be typical for a 6-year-old to engage with. And if you start seeing some social emotional delays, that could be a reason to request an assessment for being dealing with any kind of autism spectrum disorder. All right, so I'm going to pass the ball here to Dave, since this is his area of expertise. Dave, would you like to tell us a little bit more about autism spectrum disorder that we haven't covered just by briefly covering the DSM?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, to just mention that, of course, neurodiversity is a really good thing. And, sometimes they say that the variability between a person with autism and a person who's not on the spectrum is sometimes greater than two people who are, on the spectrum. So, but that being said, some of the ways that people who have Asperger's are different don't really work or aren't functional sometimes in society. And one of the problems that causes is what we see in like the unemployment rate for people who reach adulthood who are on the spectrum, because it's really, really too low. We've tried to kind of change that as a society, change how we approach that or offer opportunities. So, for example, companies have tried to look for situations where being neurodiverse in those particular ways that spectrum people are diverse in, that's a good thing and a useful thing, and they'll recruit that particular quality. But one of the things that DSM doesn't really get to is, and that you'd know when you spend time with kids who are neurodiverse, is that the difference in perceiving the world goes much deeper. It's just a different way of understanding reality. And so, example maybe is when we walk into a movie theater and there's only, when we used to before the pandemic, or hopefully getting back to, but, and there was only one person sitting in the theater. What does a neurotypical person do? Well, they'll usually sit maybe about 4 or 5 seats away, a couple of rows away. There's kind of a social algorithm that they'll just immediately know. Somebody who is on the spectrum might sit either right next to that person or at the farthest seat away from them. And that kind of speaks to this different process that they're understanding the world with. There was a way of describing it called theory of mind that somebody came up with. I think it was a guy named Woodruff back in the 70s. And that had to do with our understanding people by knowing that they have their own perspective. And so we'd have to kind of get out of our minds and try and put ourselves into the eyes of the person that we're trying to relate to. And people who are neurodiverse might have some real difficulty with that. And so instead, they'll come up with little tricks and strategies and ways to solve those kinds of problems. And so they may have a list in their heads, not necessarily walking around with a list, but in their heads of about 3 or 4 responses that you'd have when somebody smiles at you. And you feel totally overwhelmed and paralyzed and you don't know what to do. Well, you can do one of these things and pull from the list. So it's a very kind of categorical, methodical, sometimes way to operate through the world. That's what makes more sense. In the neurotypical world, sometimes we think of things much more in terms of a linear story, a story that has meaning because it has a beginning, a middle, and end. And that isn't necessarily how people on the spectrum make sense of big things. So that's why I thought it was really interesting in the film, because here's this enormous event that happened, this tragic event. How do we, the viewer, and everybody else who went through it, how do they understand and deal with the craziness of that event? How do they find some kind of meaning and comfort, versus how does Oskar have to do it? And he has to do it in his own individual way.
Which definitely is illustrated throughout the plot of this film, as we see him moving through, trying to make meaning of this massive event that upended not only his life, but the entire city and country that he calls home. And watching him struggle to make meaning of that, not just the loss of his father, but the loss of everything that he knew, sense of safety in the world, sense of normalcy, everything was taken away.
Yeah. I wonder if there were different things that you folks noticed that he was noticing about the event compared to maybe neurotypical people who experienced the same event. What were the things that you saw that you
I would say one thing I noticed was the day of, what he calls like the worst day, is he's kind of still going through his like routine, it seems like, on the way home, while everyone around him is kind of chaotic. And even like when he comes home to his building and he sees his doorman, played by John Goodman, and he's clearly having an emotional response to what he's watching on the news, Oskar is still just kind of going with his day-to-day routine and not really picking up on all the social clues around him that something today is really, really wrong or different.
Yeah, like just seeing him go in and out of the stores and get a juicy juice and be like completely unaware that, I know we didn't know a whole lot then and children were protected from it, but seeing everybody else being in his total state of terror and fear, and just watching him just go about his business and not take too much concern or recognize that, the country is under attack.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sometimes people will see this kind of behavior and they'll mistake it for a lack of caring or a selfishness or that this person's being egotistical or something like that. But if you were him, you might be thinking, no, my job is to make sure that the routine keeps going, that everything keeps happening. And that might be the only way he's at all keeping it together. Because if he really thinks about or is in touch with what was happening, I mean, how is he going to survive that?
Mm-hmm.
He wouldn't. We saw several points in time where he had outbursts throughout the film, and I think you're dead on that he was managing himself as best he could, and his routine was already disrupted by school letting him out early. So he had to do whatever he would normally do coming home from school to keep himself on his routine and feel like everything's okay. Because if I can't do the things I normally do, then everything isn't okay, and I can't process or tolerate that. So I have to keep everything okay.
Yeah, it seemed like his two choices basically were to keep going in routine or paralysis. He just couldn't move at a certain point if it got too overwhelming. So yeah.
Which is what happened. He got paralyzed by hearing his dad's voice and then knowing the phone was ringing again, knowing it was his dad calling and he couldn't answer. We saw that paralysis happen.
Yeah, that really set the traumatic theme, right, for him about what he needed to solve and mm-hmm. what he needed to grieve was his inability to answer to that.
And kind of what you were saying before about processing, it also makes sense that he tries to take this huge abstract concept, grief, and boil it down into something that has a step-by-step process to it, that has a code to it, that has a plan to it. And we see that in the movie, obviously, when he finds the key and then gets determined to, that is a quest by his father to find the lock for the key, and that he creates such a complicated system of keeping track of the boroughs and like keeping track of like all the people on the map and all the blocks that he needs to find and being willing to use the next 3 years to figure that out so that it can all make sense to him, which I think isn't, honestly, that's not an atypical response in terms of grief in general. Like, I think trying to make sense, obviously, of death and grief, and we'll talk about that more, is something everybody does. And we all can do somewhat odd closure related things to get that figured out. Like, I even think, a celebrity that I'm a fan of that has her own podcast called The Deep Dive, June Diane Rayfield. She talks about how since her dad died, she's gotten kind of obsessed with finding the exact car he drove when she was little. And she's like, I know it doesn't make sense, but something within me feels like I have to do this to kind of get my shit together. And so I think obviously with him, we see a much, I don't even know if I want to quantify like that. I was going to say much more conflated version of that, but I don't know if that's that true. But I'd say him trying to put it into a system that makes sense. You definitely see him doing that in real time and putting it within the construct of a schema he already knows, which is his dad creating. I put social opportunities for him, but I think he calls them, what does he call them? He uses a term.
He does use a term.
Not journey or quest.
I think it is quest.
I think it is quest.
Is it quest?
I think it's quest. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's interesting because go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, please go ahead.
Yeah, you don't know through the journey whether or not his dad has actually laid out this elaborate kind of thing, but you presume that no, he hasn't. Because how could he? He didn't know he was going to be in the disaster. But instead, his intention was to teach Oskar how to start journeys and how to complete them. Mm-hmm. And it seems, just coincidental in a way, but really amazing that's how he succeeds at learning his father's task.
Mm-hmm. Well, he was trying to encourage him to be adaptive through these quests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Not an easy thing, as you could see by trying every key and every lock for every person with that particular surname. which is not an uncommon kind of way of somebody with neurodiversity might think about something like that, because they're doing a lot of what they call bottom-up processing, which is try everything in order and see if it fits that category. Yeah.
Yeah, and something that I think we should talk about as, having professionals and writers here is that a lot of times when people talk about autism spectrum disorders, they confuse it with what used to be called mental retardation. And it's not. An intellectual disability and intellectual impairment does not necessarily tie into people having autism spectrum disorder. As we see with Oskar, frequently people, I think he went through it in the movie, his dad explained it to it, that sometimes people are just smarter than other people, and that because of that, there is a cost on there's some kind of cost on their social functioning, or I can't remember the right word. I don't know. Andrew, can you remember what he said there?
No.
Not just
call somebody out in like one sentence.
I do that.
No, I can't remember that one line. Sorry, go ahead. No, I'm sorry, I don't remember that one.
No, that's okay. But I think it did a good job of illustrating the point that, people with autism spectrum disorder, people what would have been called Asperger's, are frequently very highly intelligent.
One of down the years, one of the ways that it seemed to make sense to view that kind of intellectual difference, because it's not high intelligence per se, also because they'd be much more functional, but instead, we'd see hyper intelligence in very particular areas, and so it's almost like there's islands of high intelligence. And then on the social relatedness scale and emotional scale, not so much. So it's a really interesting split.
I mean, and I think it was interesting, and just from the perspective of writing the movie and having on the narrative side, I feel like there's definitely a balance of I guess speaking about functioning and that degree of his character is. The movie needed a narrative engine. So I think there was probably things that they were pushing him to do more than maybe, or in a quicker way that maybe somebody that is grappling with these issues and having to try to learn a lot of the social cues and having a lot of these challenges like Oskar has, probably wouldn't have been so quick to suddenly taking this adventure on his own and overcoming the obstacles that he does. But definitely in terms of the story, there needed to be some impulsion for him to get out and actually overcome some of these challenges in a lot faster way. So anyway, that was just something I noticed too. It seemed like, we were talking about it earlier, but even for someone who, wasn't on the autism spectrum disorder, walking from Manhattan to one of the outer boroughs would have been a really difficult thing to do. And he does it when he is afraid of loud noises and trains and also the fears that he has collected since 9/11, because a lot of his other fears seem to come from the ideas of tragedies and terrorism. So there's sort of that other component that he's dealing with on top of the autism spectrum disorder side of it, or sort of commingle together.
Well, and I feel like one of the things that the movie does really beautifully is helps us, because it really does feel like his dad planned this out for him, or it really does. I like the fact that not only is the movie from his perspective, but also with this kind of overarching theme of my dad created this quest for me and I have to finish it in order to understand where he is, or as if there was something else that would maybe lead him to him or whatever. And I think regardless of the neurodiverse part, that when a kid experiences a trauma, a lot of times they create a narrative in order to try to understand what has happened because it doesn't make sense to them. And so being able to kind of see that to see that kind of shown, I feel like it's something that we talk about a lot on our podcast in terms of how kids have to make meaning out of something, and how sometimes, depending on the age of when the trauma happened, that it can be kind of a more fantastical story than it can be kind of more grounded. So I feel like even having that part of the film, having that be a part of the film, is just helpful in terms of showcasing that piece. Along with all the other things that Oskar is trying to manage at the same time.
It seems like for him, there's an additional layer of it that he has to make sure that every key fits, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So it's not just, the meaning of the story might make sense to some kids, or it might help. Yeah, after 9/11, there was a group of school kids who witnessed the event from their school window in Manhattan, and they did a drama therapy activity with them afterwards, and essentially they were able to find a story that made sense to all of them. But for him, it's like he also has to solve all these little puzzles.
Yeah.
I mean, there's also that sort of the definite role of fantasy that, he had been trying to solve this puzzle, this elaborate fantasy that his father gave to him before he died, which was of the magical sixth borough and where it is. And then that puzzle was sort of left unsolved. And it's almost like he was grasping for the next clue in that, which it is. It's completely incidental that he even finds the key inside this vase, which we later learn is purely just was a gift for his wife that he had never gotten to give her. So, just speaking on the idea and the themes and sort of the journey of Oskar and his quest. I also noticed it was sort of a nice moment that he begins this quest, and the sort of literal, pinch moment that he has when he's standing on the bridge. I think it's the Manhattan Bridge. So he literally has to cross that bridge to begin this journey. So it kind of, brings in that fantasy element, I guess, a little bit, the sort of the world that's in his head that he's created.
And I think something too that along these lines we see with him testing every lock, that's part of where those intelligence islands would be, is it when you see people that live with this neurodiverse life, is that they have the ability to lock onto these tasks that fit within their hyperintelligence island. And as we see Oskar and his grandfather kind of battle, his grandfather's going, okay, enough for today. For Oskar, there is no enough for today. There is no solving. There is no doing enough. He's going to want to do all of it. And that's how his brain works, is that his hyperintelligence goes, no, I can try every lock. And there's no, why couldn't I try every lock? So I have to try every lock. When I worked at a residential school with kids that had this diagnosis, this was something that I would see the things that they could be capable of that fell into their hyperintelligence zones, they could achieve hours and hours of detail and massive concentration, and could create, there was one kid who created an entire galaxy for a sci-fi fantasy story, and he had maps and histories. It was almost like looking through J.R.R. Tolkien's work, where you see that level of attention to things. And we see Oskar able to do this because making these maps and making this process and trying every lock, it fits right within where his intelligences are.
Yeah, that's another thing. Sometimes people miss about people who happen to be in the world in the spectrum is that they think that, oh no, they're kind of oblivious to larger issues or broad issues. But in that example that you just gave, I think they're painfully aware of the enormity of the universe, to the point where two Lego pieces not fitting together would somehow, if they don't figure out how to fit them together, then the whole universe may come apart. And that's the feeling that they express, right? I have to put this together, and I've got to do it tonight.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of wanted to go back to what you had said earlier, Andrew, about kind of the facts versus fiction, sort of the realism around Oskar and his ability to be so autonomous in this world that is like accosting him, like in terms of his anxiety and sensory overload. I think they do show, I think what gives it a little bit more credence than another movie is the fact that they do demonstrate that he has had a lot of opportunities to kind of go out and practice this already with the little quest that his dad's put him on, and his dad gave him that card that kind of helps him explain himself to other people. So he does have a foundation. And I think he does a good job of prepping himself. He does a lot of what we call coping ahead, which is he's like, I have my bag of fig Newtons that I like to smell. I have my key that I like to rub on my face. He brings his tambourine, which it felt like to me was his sort of version of what we call stimming, which is kind of grounding yourself through, I don't know if I'm going to explain it right, but it's basically like a repetitive behavior that causes either like pleasure or grounding or, can de-escalate some anxiety when you're a lot of people on neurodivergent people like ADHD, autism, other things, like they can do behaviors that are considered stimming. And so it seemed to me like his tambourine was kind of his version of that, kind of grounding himself, because he would also do it kind of up to his ear. So kind of focusing in on that, he seemed to do it more when he was more anxious. And though that all is very realistic, that's stuff that plans that I would create with the kid that I was working with. Like, let's like get like kind of your coping bag together for when you're going to go out on an adventure. And do I think that it would have him overcome the intense sensory overload that is New York City and going on trains, like doing stuff that would make any 10-year-old, I think, overwhelmed and anxious. I know he's got a lot of drive in him, but that part does seem like, I think there's a version of this movie where he tries to do this a lot and he can't quite get there. Like maybe he gets to the end of the block, or maybe even gets on the train. But the idea that he's going to all these boroughs, that is a pretty big ask, for a kid his age and a kid with a sensory, things that could be sensory overloading. Because he talks about it, because I get really panicky, and you can see him kind of, there's one scene I think where he's like screaming on the street and covering his ears. And so I'm not saying he couldn't do it. I think he totally could do it. And I wonder if this movie oversells his ability to do it all on his own, which eventually he does get his grandfather to help him. And I think that does encourage him.
Well, and his grandfather goes with him on the public transportation.
Oh, that's true. Like
so
the train
he's
stuff.
Not doing that by himself.
That's true. The train stuff he does do with his grandpa.
And I feel like the other piece of that also is that he grew up in New York City.
That's true.
So it isn't as if he is going outside and this is a completely new experience. Like this has been something that he has been learning how to manage for a really long time. And I would imagine kind of has shifted in terms of how it feels when he was younger versus now that he knows the things to do and has these kind of different ways to manage it. So I feel like, I don't know, it doesn't feel like that big of a shift or an ask in the way that I'm thinking about it, but who knows?
I mean, I guess we kind of said this off mic, is I guess I get weary of narratives that make it seem like if you are diligent enough or disciplined enough or you want it enough, you can overpower really big stressors or really big symptoms that are true and real. And that I don't like any narrative that makes it seem like if you have enough grit, like your symptoms can melt away or you can manage them effectively.
I guess it's interesting because you brought to light, they do a great job of setup in a very short amount of time, that, and sort of a backhanded way of all of he has his entire kit that he assembles for his quest. And like you said, with the tambourine and the fig Newtons. So they do this fantastic job, like insinuating the entire history of the work that was done to bring him to this moment. So I do think that was terrific. And I guess part of what I was wishing and loving is wanting to see would be actually, maybe some of those moments where he was unable to accomplish certain things and how his parents and his father specifically worked with him to overcome or accepted it. The only one they kind of really did that with, which was sort of their bookend for the movie, was his father wanting him to get on the swing set and he wouldn't do it. And then, of course, that's the last image of the movie, I guess, sort of representing that he's, taken a step through the grief process. But, it would have been nice to, I guess, see a little bit more of the challenges he faced versus it was all sort of shown in this very positive light of these quests with his father that sort of, to me, made them feel more like games than giving him abilities to interact with other people.
Yeah, I'm sure there were a lot more instances of his father telling him, okay, walk up to the counter and tell them that you want, a small Coke or something like that. And him not being able to do that kind of thing. Those are the daily kind of practices and challenges. And
and to me,
that would have allowed him to, go up to the different people at the different doors.
And I know time-wise it's only a movie, but I miss those moments, and I thought it would have made the moments when he does it on his own and when he is autonomous, doing taking these steps. I think it would have made it more powerful to see him taking those lessons into practice, actually being there with him and his father as they're attempting to do it. And also it would help to me showing the disconnect that he has with his mother, because it was really his father's ability to understand how his brain works and functions, to create these systems to help him cope.
That was a really interesting feature too. How trauma created discontinuity in the family, because his family had been in World War II, and then there was that story, and there were breaks in connection. And then somehow, those were kind of solved through this healing process too, even though he had to solve them in his very specific way or atypical way. But his dad, and I guess from his perspective, he might think, well, I've lost my parent, and another family member has come in to kind of fit in that. Not that anybody could replace his dad, but there was another human being there that he could invite into that sort of realm. It's really interesting how they kind of go back and forth between, how do we experience this when we're watching the movie and we're empathizing with all of these different layers of meaning versus how does he deal with this, and what's he experiencing and how does he have to go about solving those problems.
They really worked the generational trauma angle in so well. Like, it was the inclusion of Max von Sydow as grandfather, and his facial acting was just fantastic. And like seeing him have to heal from what trauma did to him and the shame and mistakes of him not being able to parent his son, and now trying to and having to kind of go through his own journey with his grandson to repair what of that he can with himself. It was just such a fantastic addition of layers to this story.
And the grandfather's inability to be there, he tries to be there to listen, to be that receptacle for Oskar, but then can't actually go there in the end. So it leaves Oskar sort of halfway to that moment of coming to terms with not being able to listen to that voicemail, which I thought that was, very powerful. I wish I would have loved to have learned what happened with the grandfather and the grandmother story more. Again, I guess my sort of everything with me in this movie is like, I wanted more. So.
Yeah. Did you read the book?
I have not read the book.
It definitely made me, and I can talk more in final thoughts, but it definitely made me really want to read the book.
Yeah.
Because the way that the language of it was so beautiful. I wrote down a lot of quotes, and I don't write a lot of quotes when we watch movies. And just the way that, even kind of going back to like, I think it does a good job with the facts and the fiction sort of part of it too, of that Oskar is very matter of fact. His social skills can be a little rusty in that he, can struggle with the reciprocity piece like we talked about before. And I think what I liked about it is he was still very empathetic and sweet. And like when he met Viola Davis's character, he was like, can I give you a kiss on the cheek? And he's very imaginative and silly and open in a way that I think a lot of media that portrays autism has a very like robot-y, clinical, demonstration of it. And so I think this movie did such a great job of showing the inner world that he lives in without it becoming like a stereotype or, kind of, like a monolith that we see a lot with, people that are portrayed as neurodivergent. But I know we're kind of sliding into the topic of grief. So I'm wondering, is there anything else you want to talk about specifically about autism spectrum before we slide into the topic of grief?
Okay, so this is a good spot for us to add a quick break. So we're going to take a quick break here. And we're back. So the next part of this episode, we're going to be examining the way that grief is portrayed, because while autism spectrum disorder is a tremendous part of Oscar's story, there's also how he resolves grief, which drives the plot. Because what we learn throughout this film is the film is constructed in a way that keeps us engaged in following the mystery. It only shows us a little bit of a time of what is it that Oscar is really grieving the most, because we know he loses his father. And we just assume that that's what his grief is about. But as we go through the film, you learn that the thing that is causing the most grief and shame for him is that he didn't answer the phone, that he couldn't bring himself to answer the phone when his dad was calling the last time before the building fell. And what I loved about that is one of the things that I have to explain to clients all the time is that when we're trying to resolve grief and shame throughout the course of trauma work, is that the moment a trauma occurs is not when something happens to our body or when something happens to someone that loves us. We've had many times in our lives when we get injured, we get hurt, somebody hurts us, but it doesn't cause a traumatic response. What causes a traumatic response is when something causes you to think differently about yourself or your world, or yourself in the world. And him not being able to answer that phone call was the thing that changed the way he defined himself. Losing his father and going through all the events of the tragic horror that was 9/11 is one thing, but the very personal part was when he couldn't answer that phone, when his dad was calling and listening to his dad's voice, pleading for someone to talk to him, to answer the phone, knowing he was trying to reach him. At least that's his interpretation. So what we see is that with trauma, when you have a moment like that produces shame deactivates the emotion that you need to feel in order to process the trauma. Feelings are the only way we have to make sense of experiences. You don't remember your drive to work on June 17th of 2013 because probably nothing happened. We have a file in our head that stores all of the irrelevant information we go through in a day and just file it away and ignore it, which is your drive to work, the things you do to get lunch. It all becomes irrelevant. You have no emotional attachment to it. But when events happen that require us to feel something, we must feel the feeling in order to encode it. And Oscar can't do that because shame is blocking him from being able to feel what he feels because he doesn't feel like he deserves to heal because he didn't answer the phone. So he doesn't get to heal because he wasn't brave enough. And watching him go through that journey, I thought was beautifully illustrated in this film. I don't know if you guys saw the same thing, but I saw that and it struck a major chord for me of how we get through trauma is by allowing ourselves to feel and releasing ourselves from the guilt that keeps us trapped in the moment we started thinking differently about ourselves or our world.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was so beautifully done. And actually, this was my second time watching it, and I found it far more powerful on a second viewing. And maybe it was also the proximity to the 20th anniversary of 9/11. But I mean, everything in the movie and his quest that we've been talking about, it was all sort of him not dealing with that one central traumatic moment where he didn't answer the phone, and yet it was all about that at the same time. And every step further he was taking. I mean, I think he even had a line or something about he he was feeling closer to his father than ever and yet further away from him. And it was also part of his obsession with time. And I just thought that was sort of that whole frame was just sort of so beautiful in terms of that. I'm probably not doing a good job of explaining it, but yeah, I just thought that was such an amazing representation of grieving and shame and how someone is not dealing with grief and dealing with it at the same time.
Yeah, it's amazing what happens. Like shame is it's a deactivator to arousal states. That's why it exists. Shame exists to stop us from doing things. You have to be so physiologically aroused before you can strike someone, right? You have to be a certain level of anger or hurt or scared before you're going to physically harm another person. But if you get there, you can. But something exists to turn that off, to stop the arousal state from happening. And that's what shame does. The problem is when you're trying to process and heal from a trauma, and when your body has entered a state where you feel safe enough to do so, that shame can stop you from feeling the feeling you need to in order to understand the event fully. And it creates this trap where you almost spiral on the event, that the part that you're stuck on doesn't fit into the context of the story anymore. You only remember the scene. You don't remember the whole film that happened that caused the trauma, and you get stuck replaying that scene over and over and over again until you can reach a point where you can release yourself from the guilt of feeling like something's your fault, or you did something wrong, or you could have done something better. And trauma doesn't resolve fully until you can get to that point where you can create a more balanced and healthy thought and perception of the event. Let's say you were in a car accident and the passenger that was riding with you died. Someone is likely going to be continually replaying that moment over and over where they made the decision to enter the intersection. But the questions that we get to ask ourselves in hindsight torture us when we've had a traumatic event. Over and over again, they torture us. So the driver of that car would be probably asking themselves, did I not look? Did I not see? Was I too busy singing the song? Did I not look? Was there anything I could have done different? And so long as they believe that there was something they didn't do right and hold that against themselves, they will not let themselves heal from the trauma. They will not let themselves move on and go, I did all that I could. The fault of the accident was that somebody ran a red light and there was nothing I could have done to see it.
Well, and you literally see him going over that over and over again when he goes into that, I think it's like a closet, his safe space, and he has the answering machine and he's listening to those messages over and over and over again. And then he's even, as he was describing to his grandfather, how he's calculated all the steps and where he was at the exact time all those 6 messages were. But it's the 6th message that he was at home that's the point where he's stuck. And it's not like answering the phone would have changed the outcome of his father dying, too. So there's that whole entire process. It's just that huge level of guilt attached to not picking up the phone and having that last final word with his father. But I just thought that was it's every time you see it, it's just always so heart-wrenching, the idea that that's what he's doing all the time when he's by himself, is listening to those messages again.
Mm-hmm.
And you putting it that way. Oh, go ahead, Dave. Sorry.
There's this really interesting way that they show like flashback, and where they show that kind of stuck place where that trauma is coming back into your head over and over again. And I think that's they have this sort of thing about around 8 seconds or so, where there's a brief period of time where you have the opportunity to solve a puzzle, and he kind of brings that up, that Oskar brings that up, that he has a certain amount of time to figure out what's happened. But the flashback, unfortunately, that he keeps pulling up is this image that he's got of his dad actually, falling to the ground. And he's researched on the internet and found that image, as somebody with autism might actually do, because that would be part of the picture. And it's almost as if he has this time to solve the puzzle before his dad reaches the ground. They also play it out in a couple of other ways because, there's a thing where people keep walking away and leaving invitations or opportunities for you to solve the puzzle. And so at one point, his grandfather crosses a bridge and leaves a note for him. And his grandfather's walking away. He's got about just a few seconds to go pick up the note. And then when the grandmother is inviting the grandfather back into her life, she leaves this bag of groceries on the floor. And he has to, and he has a few seconds to make a choice and solve the puzzle and figure it out and then go on. So it's really interesting how this family, it seems more idiosyncratic to the family that they feel like, okay, there's a moment in time where you have to get it, you have to realize something, and then you'll be okay. Yeah.
Right. And if that worked its way into how he understood the rules of the world, especially like him being a 10-year-old, let alone being a neurodivergent 10-year-old, but him being a 10-year-old, that would be the only way he interpreted the world. And that I failed that puzzle. And that means I failed my dad and I can never fix it. And he's stuck in this loop of over and over again, trying to go back to see where he could have done something different. But the truth is that he was freezing. He was experiencing such intense hyperarousal that he froze, which could have happened to anyone. To be in such an intense moment that you just can't face hearing your dad's voice for the last time and knowing you're talking to him for the last time. And I thought it was really interesting that the movie focused so much on the falling and him looking at the picture, but then it reminded us that this was in 2001 and the ability to find a picture that's a clear shot of anything on the internet was awful and pixelated. And we don't know that was his dad. It was alluded to, but it was also shown that when mom was talking to him at that exact time, they showed that's when the building fell and we knew he was there on the phone. So the likelihood that his dad was actually one of the ones who jumped, it doesn't seem like that was what happened, but that's the story he told himself.
Yeah. Well, I think you see like how when the movie opens, he gets really angry at the funeral, right? Because there's no body in there. What is this even for? And so I think what he's struggling with, which I don't even know if I would say this is because he's neurodivergent or if it's his age or just in general, but like finding meaning in that ceremony because there isn't a physical body there and wanting to kind of find that physical body and not even just in pictures as a way to make meaning for himself. Because that's what his mom's trying to, in one of like the big fights they have in the movie, what she's trying to impress upon him is kind of the symbolism of like grief and like how that can also help maybe tie up some of these loose ends he's feeling either from shame or just grief in general and how he can't feel that. And so he's trying to make meaning of his own. But I think that is what ties for me, like the poignancy of like the falling man and even the pop-up book he makes for his mom at the end of kind of the man going backwards up into the building hole is him trying to find something physical that he can grab onto.
It's almost like he understands the physics of it now. The physics of grief.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he didn't find comfort in the metaphorical parts of grief, the symbolic parts of grief that his mom was trying to explain to him, which makes total sense to me. Even for his age to feel that frustration.
Absolutely.
Right. And mom did the best that she could to help him through the symbolic parts of that. But mom was missing part of the story. He never told her. He never showed her the answering machine. He replaced the answering machine. He re-recorded the same message and told her that there was no one on there, which showed me that he is still trapped in his guilt, that he could never let her in and let her know what he did. And he hasn't recovered from that yet. And I'll come back to that when we talk about treatment more. But when you see people in trauma, they keep secrets of what they did because they feel so ashamed of the choice that they made or were unable to make in the moment due to their level of physiological arousal and distress at the time, that they are not capable of functioning at the intellectual level that they think they should be at in an ideal situation. And because of that, they are the ones that live the situation, not an objective observer like we are, that they can't process that there is no way you could have. It is okay that you couldn't answer. Your body chose that for you. Your body was trying to protect you from horrid trauma, and it shut down. And that's what happens. Your body will choose that. It's part of your fight or flight system. And when you go through that, you don't think about it that way because you were the one going through it. And that's the only perspective you have. And as a 10-year-old who already struggles with understanding social things, is really keeping a massive secret from his mom and not letting himself off the hook for that because he doesn't understand that he just couldn't answer that call.
And a nice metaphor for like the emotional, maybe the disconnection between his mother and him was the moment when he's going out on one of his journeys for the day, and it's through the closed door that he knows his mother's waiting and listening, and that's when he says "I love you" to the little slot under the door, which was, I thought, just a nice moment of like that's basically summarizes they can't actually. There's a wall dividing them, which in another way it feels like there's another part of his grief, which is, not just the loss of his father and sort of the entire life that they had, but also for him. His father represented the only person that he was able to connect with. Like they talk about his like oxymoron battles and those sorts of moments that they have together, that they literally speak a language that he can't connect with his mother and speak with her. So he's almost sort of beyond the shame and the guilt and all that you're talking about as well. It's sort of like he's more alone than ever. He doesn't have anyone that can translate his world.
I think maybe like an interesting just like counterpoint to that is, his dad was definitely like his person, who seemed to, even though they do an interesting job in the movie of showing a scene where you can tell that his dad is frustrated with him for not going on the swing. Like it wasn't this thing, like magical thing where his dad was always like, it's okay, Oscar, and going with the flow. And like his dad in that moment, you could tell wanted to be like, why can't you just
be a normal
snap out of it?
Well,
Yeah.
Also,
And having that brief kind of like, but taking space and like still didn't bring attention to it. But I thought it was interesting that the movie like made a point of adding that in there. And I think, but like the counterpoint of him being his person is, I think sometimes when you do have someone that just kind of gets you, especially when you lose that person, there can be I don't know how I want to put it, like almost not like a fantasy that person was always perfect and was always knew what to say and always was the perfect situation. And what the indirect result of that can be then a inability to see how other people can also be that for you. And he does do a good job. I think you referenced this quote earlier, Andrew, of every time I left the apartment, I could feel myself getting closer to my dad and farther away from my mom. So it's like he was kind of aware that he was making a conscious effort to reconnect with his dad and not connect with his mom. And I think in those moments when she stays at the door and kneels on the ground, and like also as we find kind of in the twist at the end that she knew what he was doing, I think it kind of showed that his mom maybe did understand him more than he realized. And she just wasn't his person when her husband was alive. And so I wonder how much she kind of took the natural back seat because his dad was such a caregiver for him. And now that she is the primary caregiver, she has to kind of fill in those holes in a way that she didn't have to before. And kind of for Oscar, kind of also requiring him to adapt to the idea that more than one person can be your person. Like even the grandfather, like he does the oxymoron like debate with him on the train. And I think that was a really poignant moment of showing Oskar, like, you can do this with other people. Your dad wasn't the only person who would ever get you and could do these fun things with you. And I think over the course of this movie, he meets a lot of people that, including people who already knew, his mom and, you know, his grandpa who just met, of like, there can be other people that fill up these parts of you. It doesn't just have to be your dad, and therefore you are kind of screwed. You're in a panic place because he's never coming back.
Yeah, it's almost like he's saying, "Well, I love you, Mom, but I can't. You can't help me with this particular problem." Mm-hmm. Which, in some respects, you might think is kind of a setup that the dad did, because he gave them this in this very, very particular, way of getting through things, and the mom just didn't do things that way. And so, in a way, he kind of iced her out of being able to help when he was gone. So, but the grandfather, I guess, was close enough to the dad, resembled him enough to be able to fulfill that.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like the part about just the understanding that he doesn't have the same connection with his mom is not because she's not trying to have a connection with him. It's not because she refuses to understand him, right? It's because dad has been the one really holding that spot, and that she is happy to be a part of the family by kind of standing, maybe just next to dad, but not like across from dad, where like she's over here on her own island and she doesn't understand anything, right? Because I think even what I found to be really kind of loving and kind of magical was when she knows to wait. Like, she knows that he might stop outside of the door. Like, that idea that she understands him more than he realizes, and only hasn't seen it because dad was maybe more just, I don't even know if straightforward is the right way to put it, but more boisterous about it, maybe, in terms of his understanding of it. Like, having someone who's so, maybe even just more reactive. Dad might just be sillier. Dad might just be more inventive and imaginative. Like, dad might just have had a personality that just clicked into Oskar's. Yeah. And worked until, obviously it couldn't any longer.
They kind of had private language a little bit too, and that's sometimes something that we see between certain parents and certain kids, where they figure out a way, and usually it's because of the parent trying to really, really get inside the child's heart and that child's head, and to understand for both of them, if I see things through your perspective, how can I communicate this to you? And I think dad was just a little better at that particular thing for him.
Go ahead, Ben.
Something that I also want to touch on with this is that as we're looking at this, remembering that this is a perspective film and that it's coming from the perspective of Oskar, is that sometimes when people go through a loss, particularly one that they are experiencing trauma on and are hyper-focused on trying to resolve the traumatic part of it, is that they can start to distort the relationship or the importance of it, and focusing on not taking away how important dad was in this and saying that was necessarily present in this story. It just is a question I have of wonder is how much is Oskar hyper fixating on the moments he had with his dad, and that's what we're seeing, as opposed to how involved mom was, because of how in touch she is with him. And we know that we only get a moment or so where he's describing that she's been depressed, but I wonder how much of that factors into kind of where he is at with these memories of dad. Like, dad was obviously great. I mean, they chose Tom Hanks for that role for a reason. Tom Hanks is everybody's dad. Yeah. But for the perspective to be so focused on dad and not involve mom, but yet mom appears to be so connected to him, I think that didn't just evolve, but that is partially a matter of how the trauma is manifesting in him, and that he is fixating more on his relationship with his dad and what that meant to him, because that's gone. And we see a lot of him grasping onto what's gone and what he can't have anymore. And that happens to people who've had loss, is that they start shifting their perspective to inflate the value that a relationship with someone else had in their life to be a bit more than it was. and for it to take up a little bit more space after the person is gone than it did when the person was around.
Definitely. And
it's interesting.
Go ahead, Andrew.
No, please go ahead.
I was just going to say
the Zoom thing here.
No worries. We've been very tech unblessed today in this recording.
Yes, we have.
So another thing I would say too, that is a big factor possibly in the relationship to Oskar and his mom, is they're both grieving deeply simultaneously of someone who is the person in both of their lives. And when I've worked with families where it's the single parent, like the parent that's still here, and the kid, that in itself is a point of conflict. And the fact that you are both in an equal, I wouldn't say an equal, but you're both in tremendous pain.
Yeah.
And you're both trying to hang in there, and it's spilling over onto each other, especially if it's a single kid and a single parent, which I've had before, and like in this movie. And I think the fights in this movie were very accurate. They felt like fights conflict I've had to help manage in a therapeutic space, where it's hard to be as boundaried as a parent in those moments. Like, she is messy there too. And in a way that I don't fault for her, like I felt really deep empathy for her, because it becomes this, we're in this together, kind of, there's the two of us. And I know we don't really see the relationship blossom in the movie in that way. And I guess I wonder when people are watching this movie if they thought that she was being inappropriate in her fight with him. But to me, that was very authentic, of her kind of being at her wit's end with him. She's, as we know now, she's been really patient, really been actually like creating a lot of like fear and anxiety within herself by letting him go off and do his own thing. And then when he comes in and is like attacking her, kind of, it makes sense. I think that was very authentic. And that can be a bridge, not a bridge. It can be a wall between, like, with that grief, just conflating conflict within the relationship. I thought that was represented really well.
Yeah.
In this movie, and how it just colors every interaction you have. And it doesn't necessarily bond you. It kind of does by the end of it for them.
Yeah,
but it
absolutely.
also can do what we see mostly, which is cause conflict, because you're both just kind of open wound, walking around each other, trying not to run into each other all the time.
Yeah.
And then being mad that you're both messes.
It felt so important that they included the mess. They left the mess in, because just if you're watching the movie and you were alive during 9/11, you kind of have a little bit of that mess inside that you relate to, right? And it's almost like that helps us, the viewer, make sense of how all of this stuff can happen, and this great adventure can happen, but at the same time, it's just a complete ugly thing, a horrible thing,
Yeah, the mess part, since you guys brought that up, like, I thought that the depiction of the meltdowns that they showed in this film were really, really well done. And the acting of Thomas Horn, when they had that conversation where he just drove the stake into his mom's heart about, I wish it was dad instead of you. And you could see in his face that he meant it with every being of his soul, was so accurate. When I would see kids in crisis, and the kids that we worked with at the school I worked at had crisis often, that was a very accurate presentation of what can happen when kids that live with neurodivergence are so activated and have no social inhibition when it comes to that they can just say exactly what's going to hurt the most and what they mean. And the acting of this, I thought, illustrated what can happen really, really well. And I thought that was one of the most painful moments of the film, to watch him just dress his mom down like that.
Yeah, that was actually, the most effective. Those were the most effective moments for me, when I was most emotionally connected to the film. Yeah. And to your earlier point, I was actually wondering, the idea of because the movie is so in Oscar's point of view, like absolutely 100%. I mean, he's in every shot of the movie. That idea of Was he exaggerating how much his dad's role, because of his dad, was gone? Those questions you raised earlier, I was just wondering if that was that a deliberate choice in the filmmaking and the writing and the movie to actually create that sense, or was that just a product of the mother being undeveloped as a character? Because I sort of wondered about that, because I felt like there's a Kramer versus Kramer version of this movie where you see the mother trying to adapt to the absence of the father and create those routines, or maybe showing that she knows it more than that she is able to step into that role to some extent, and he's just rejecting it because she's not him. But there's no indication of her sense of whether she can handle this. I mean, well, no, who could handle it, but whether she was as engaged as her husband in this journey or not. They just sort of left all of that out. So as far as her as a character, you really only just see her as a product, sort of as a mirror to his grief, and her own. She has no other dimension, which I thought was a bit unfortunate.
Yeah. And like you're saying, it definitely could be a product of the movie being so from his point of view. Like, she's just not around in a lot of it. And we don't know what she's doing. Is she just at work? Is she in her bedroom sobbing? Is she in her own therapy? Like, what is she doing in those moments when he is more inclined to go towards his grandma or go towards his newfound grandpa? And I mean, I kind of think, going back to the first topic within grief, like the shame, I also wonder if that, I'm assuming it is like the big part of that distance as well, is I feel guilty when I'm around you because I know the dad called and I didn't answer. And so pushing her away because of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I was even thinking about just in general, in terms of losing a parent, but wanting to push away the other parent so you never have to be in that kind of pain again. I mean, not something that maybe would be permanent, but something that would definitely happen within the first year. Like, just in terms of, this is so painful and so awful, I don't want to get closer to you because of what if something happens to you. So like that would be like, that could also be on another part of this as well. And I feel like in terms of, even though we don't get a lot of the story about mom, I did really appreciate the parts where she was genuine in terms of saying to him, I wish it was me too. Yeah. And that while maybe some people don't think that would be appropriate, but how appropriate it is in terms of them needing to find a place where they connect, in terms of, we both miss this person so much in a similar way, even though he was your dad and my partner.
Yeah. I really like that she said that as a child therapist, and a family therapist. I really like that she said that, and that when he tried to backpedal, because he is a really sweet kid, and like he was, in tuned, socially in that way. And he saw, like, as soon as he did, he was like, I don't mean it. And she's like, yeah, you did. And I honestly, like, I could, like you were saying, Hannah, I could see people being put off by that. Yeah. And I think that if that happened in front of me in my office, I think that would be a breakthrough moment, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Over finally getting to common ground.
It's kind of like she's saying, if we're going to have a relationship here, if we're going to be able to get through our grief, we can't do it by lying to each other. We have to be honest about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I thought, like, another thing, and like just from the acting perspective that I watched in that scene was, watching both him and Sandra Bullock react so differently, where like he saw that he hurt her. We saw her wear that pain. She did such a great job of showing her pain, and he showed his anger so well. And seeing that he could feel aware that he had hurt her and he didn't mean to, but he couldn't muster enough of the empathy and the thing to show physically, and that it was convincing enough that he didn't mean it, because she knew he did, and he knew he did, and he couldn't show that. And that's something that kids that aren't dealing with a spectrum disorder might be able to generate a little bit more of the physical response that would go along with sorrow and guilt, and might have given her a hug or snuggled up to her. And he didn't do any of that. Like, he was able to do what he understood to do, which was to tell her, like, I didn't mean to say that. but he wasn't able to muster up enough of the physical reaction to it as well that would make it convincing.
So Ben, I'm wondering what you think of the self-harm that he does, because he has that kind of compulsion too to physicalize his pain.
I thought that was a wonderful inclusion. Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry. Those are more the Zoom delay thing.
No, I was just wondering if that kind of fits with what you were just saying and how you'd work that, you see that part of it.
I think I saw it the same way that you're hinting at, is that seeing him like recognize that he is causing pain and that he can't escape his pain. And that typically when we see self-harm, it's a repetitive behavior, but usually when you see self-harm, it's that this pain is so ethereal that I can't concretize it. And to be able to pinch myself and to hurt myself, at least I can feel some of this pain and do something with it that makes me feel like I'm punishing myself for what I feel and what I've done, and that I can also concretize it so that I can understand it, because otherwise it just floats around me like an aura of hurt, a fog of pain.
Mm-hmm.
And I really appreciated them including that, because that would absolutely happen, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is kind of, I guess it's not quite related to the subject we were just talking about, but to throw it out there, I did find it was interesting. The movie broke its own rule, and maybe there are other moments where it went outside the POV of Oskar, but they show the mother that she did speak to the father, mm-hmm. That she had a conversation with him. Mm-hmm. When she was in the office and telling him to get home. But then the interesting thing that I ask is, did she ever say that to Oskar? Did she ever tell him? Because so much of his pain, and I'm thinking the mother had to have known he'd taken that answering machine. I just don't buy it. I mean, we even show
brand new. Like,
exactly.
They look different.
Yeah, they even make a point with that close up.
I've tried to get away with stuff like that before, and it never works.
And also just knowing that she definitely went through his room to try and figure out what was going on.
Yeah, so she would have seen that.
She would have seen it. She probably listened to all the messages, whether or not she's aware of what. That he hadn't listened to the last one because he was there. Like, it just feels like I feel like she knew, and maybe she was waiting for him to tell her, or maybe she knew that it didn't matter, because it still doesn't change the fact that he died and that they weren't together when they found out that he died.
And maybe, I didn't even think about this, but it's a good point. I'm sure there's a world in which she listened to the voicemails, and then maybe part of her was like, thank God Oskar didn't pick up the phone, because I can't stop thinking about my phone call with him.
Yeah.
I wonder if that was one of her avoidances. I mean, if it was intentional, then maybe it was, congruent with her PTSD, her trauma, because there had to have been some kind of avoidance that she was dealing with too, right? To have the diagnosis. Mm-hmm.
I agree with you 100% that I think that they were both avoiding that. And that was something, when we would need to see resolved later, is that secret they were both keeping from each other, that even though mom may have had more insight, because moms always know what you have hidden between your mattress and the box spring, they always knew. Whatever was there, the parents knew what you had. You did not have a good hiding space in your house. Mom knew. And I think that being a parallel, that they were both trying to protect each other from the very thing that they needed to do to heal from the trauma, is the part of the story we didn't see. That's the resolution that happened after.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or needs to happen yet.
Yeah. And I would also, you could argue too that the way this kind of family systemically deals with maybe like hard feelings and creating quote unquote boundaries around them is by keeping secrets. The whole thing with the grandpa and the grandma saying that he is a renter and don't talk to the renter. Like, there is kind of, you could argue, a pattern within this family of, keeping secrets in order to prevent pain, and that being kind of somewhat normalized. I don't know. It's not a fully formed thought, but just throwing that out there.
I don't think you're wrong in terms of when we have the structure, the system of a family, that a lot of times it's very rare that family secrets all of a sudden stops being something that's a part of the system.
Yeah.
Like that's not typically something that is different. Like because you have to make an active choice for that to not be something that you're doing. And a lot of times that includes therapy or an intervention or a change of some kind. That's very intentional. So my guess would be even the idea of, and again, I know we don't have proof of this, but I even think about Tom Hanks knowing. So was the renter only there after he died?
I think so.
Okay.
It's a year between.
It's a year between the beginning of the movie and the end of the movie.
Yeah.
Because I was also thinking, like, if he knows that he is alive and around, like, why would his mom keep that from him? Like, there's so many different things that we don't know, but I think it would be hard to imagine that family secrets isn't a part of the way that this family has been structured just in general. Whether that's secrets between Dad and Oskar, or between his grandma and even maybe Oscar's mom. Like there could be family secrets between there. Like there's a lot of different things that can happen. And part of what makes it so hard for a kid to understand is that that's when we start with this narrative where something must have happened. No one will talk about it. And now I have to make up a connection in order to understand the world or in order to understand what's happening in front of me. So, and I think what's really interesting and what I do wonder, I mean, it does make sense because we're watching the movie and because they're also pointing at all the things to point out that he is obviously the grandfather. But that in a lot of ways, that wouldn't be a natural conclusion to like,
well, it's very cinematic.
Yeah, like it's very like movie magic, like bullshit. Like, like I can't imagine that would be something that would, or even that a parent who had been so severed, right? We talk about patterns, we talk about cutoffs in relationships, and that he would all of a sudden come back because the son that he never knew died. Like, I can't imagine that would be something that would naturally happen either. Like, I feel like that would be an even bigger indicator to stay away forever. Because if I hadn't been around, then what would it have mattered? So I feel like, but there's definitely those patterns of broken off relationships and how even if that's not something that we do as a kid, but it's something that we see happen on a regular basis, or that there's this miscommunication or this piece where the adults don't seem to all be on the same page, kids will figure out a way for that to make sense for them.
And so he could have made up a story in his head that he's my grandfather, even if he wasn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Like, and that wouldn't have had.
So we've sort of talked about like the direct relationships to Oskar with grief, but like we also talked about, referenced earlier, is like the collective grief of something like 9/11 that is experienced nationally and internationally in a lot of ways. Yeah. And even now, like we're talking about, we're about at the 20th anniversary, it comes up again culturally. So it's also something that keeps getting revisited for us. And so I think we see a lot of, I guess, I don't want to say pros, so that seems stupid, but like, I guess some of the silver linings of collective grief is everywhere he goes, he gets very taken care of, Oskar. And we find a lot of that is because his mom also comes in front of him and kind of front loads his interactions with these strangers. And I think because of the collective grief of 9/11, a lot of people like kind of do a lot to try to help heal him. Like when he's in that circle where they're kind of praying over him, and like those one family like has him ride horses, and you know, it's a lot of kind of the magic that can come from something collective of like kind of all like truly like it takes a village kind of energy.
Absolutely. Instead of let's all just pretend this didn't happen.
Yeah.
Right.
Or like it didn't happen to me, so it didn't, like it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Andrew, you have some New York connections, so you could probably speak to how, as a city, you know, whether or not this would be a feeling that people would have of, you know, taking care of one of their own.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I saw it with some of my professors when I was there that, I mean, one of them was talking about his day. I mean, I remember just them talking about, I was there not too many years after 9/11. And they all definitely lived with it. You could see they all had this moment where they were in Washington Square Park watching the buildings. It was I think they said one of the only days NYU ever shut down. So, I mean, and I just see that in New York and just sort of the way everyone sort of pulls together and cares for each other. Even I remember I was at a parade and a child was lost and everything shut down and everyone searched for the kid. So I found that totally believable. and so poignant that it's, the city sort of is, in weird ways, New York City everyone has this idea of it being sort of rude and individualistic, and yet it's a city of how many millions, and you have to learn to live with each other. And New York seems to be continuously bound in these moments of extreme grief, like 9/11 and the early days of the pandemic. So that, there's just a fascination in that, on that side of things. I was sort of a little bit disappointed. Again, the movie almost had a sort of a comedic, lighthearted aspect to it with these different individuals.
Yeah.
And I think it was, again, sort of, it went into montage mode. And I was just so disappointed because they were even insinuating that each one of these people had their own interactions with 9/11. The woman that closes the door both on Oskar and the mother. And you can almost sort of imagine that she lost someone at 9/11 too.
Yeah.
And I just thought it's just such a missed opportunity, which I guess if we talked about sort of how, if I would have had a chance to play around with it, if you could expand it to like a limited series, I would say each one of these is so worthy of exploration, because each one of these people, and maybe it's not 9/11 centric, that the grief they're going through, but
even just the grief of losing a loved one, losing a part of your life that happened so suddenly and so unexpectedly. Absolutely. Like that's losing a loved one, losing things that we love is something that we all have in common.
Absolutely. And I think Oskar learning that and talking about it was such a powerful moment in healing for him, that he learned the truth laid out for us, that suffering is an unavoidable part of the human experience.
Absolutely.
And that everyone is going through it. And that while your loss is deeply personal and individualized, the narrative we create for ourselves that no one can understand what I'm going through is profoundly untrue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting. And there's something with 9/11 and like the collective grief idea. So often if it was just, my father died of cancer, let's say. You might find someone who had that, or it's just kind of an awkwardness around it. But everybody's had an ownership of that day and sort of almost adopted him and his pain. And either they could connect on it personally, or they at least understood it because they felt like they shared it with him. Anyways, I just thought that was
really close to. You're really close to what Viktor Frankl said about when he was an existential psychotherapist. You probably know, but what he said about creating meaning in situations where there is none to be held and where everything is just destroyed and dark. He said we still have this responsibility to find our way to create that and to step on the next step and keep going somehow. And so it seems like that's what Oskar does, is he keeps just taking that next step, that next incredibly painful step, and for everybody who went through that, to wake up that next day and figure out how you're going to live that next day after 9/11.
And I think everybody getting to be part of his journey was part of them experiencing exactly what Frankl talked about, which is trying to find meaning of helping this little boy. So in doing that, his mom helped tie together the whole city, that everyone that encountered him also then got to make some meaning of what happened to them by sharing with him and starting to move their lives forward by finding something to give them purpose again.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Anything.
And there was that beautiful moment at the end where it almost sort of encapsulates all of those points with when he sends the thank you letter to all of them. That
cry. So sweet.
And it's almost like, they're all bound and connected, and he does help them kind of come to some resolution and give meaning to it all. But they were already all connected anyways, as we all sort of have been. And it's weird now because we're meeting people that, are now in their 20 or turning 20. And
for students, when I talk to them about snapshot memories and trauma memories and things like that, I used to be able to use 9/11 as the example, but now they just kind of look back at me like, well, I've heard about it and read about it, but I was just a baby. So you have to find something. Unfortunately, tragedy keeps happening. And,
I mean, the previous, I think, snapshot was where were you when Kennedy was shot, which is,
or Reagan.
Yeah.
Which now makes a lot more sense how it felt hearing like my mother's portrayal of when Kennedy died, in terms of remembering exactly where I was when I heard about what was going on in New York, and how, and not being able to really imagine not knowing about that, or not knowing the feeling that's associated with that from a person who just wasn't around yet. So, yeah.
All right. So should we take a quick ad break here and then move into treatment?
Yes.
All right. Let's take a quick break. All right, and we're going to move into the treatment section. So who would like to start talking about where we would do a treatment intervention on this family, or on Oskar, or on Mom?
I mean, I think something that comes up for me, I want to make this short and sweet, is I do think how Mom intervenes with Oskar is very similar to the free range parenting I was talking about a few episodes ago. So if you have thoughts about like how she chose to deal with that, I would encourage you to listen to our Spirited Away episode, where I get into like the concept of free range parenting, and she does a lot. So to like kind of caveat that, talking about this particular situation, is that she does a lot of what you can do in free range parenting, which is she goes ahead of Oskar and sets him up for more safety and success by kind of vetting the people that he's going to be encountering, and then giving them a heads up to help him if he is maybe out of his depth. And so I thought that was a really real portrayal of how to create a safe situation for your child to explore independently. And I also love that they demonstrate in the movie how that takes a toll on her emotionally, and like her cortisol levels must be astronomical.
Oh my God. I can't
you
even
see
imagine.
like even just that brief, like talking about the acting, but that brief, like her body language when he comes in the door and she tries to act like, oh, hey, what's up? Like it's a normal day. And then her whole body like heaves forward because he's finally home. And so I think like, just speaking as a child therapist, obviously I would have to work with, I wouldn't have to, obviously I'd work with Oskar. And I think with him, I would probably try to do not necessarily play therapy. I think it would depend on where he's at. I could see where he would find play therapy condescending or patronizing, and I want to be respectful of where he's at developmentally. He's at that tricky age, 10, where, especially with like having neurodivergency on top of that, where I'd have to kind of figure out where he's at emotionally and try to meet him there age-wise. But I could see, because he's done so much in the world kind of stuff, he might be a kid where I would do our therapy sessions outside, or at the park, or swinging on the swing set, or playing basketball together. And I don't think that people know that you can do that, as long as you get like permission from parents and the kid, and it's a private enough space.
And don't tell the insurance company.
And don't tell the insurance companies. You can,
because they ruin everything.
You can't introduce the environment when working with the kid, who might also, because with the social part of it, sometimes it can be really hard to do, I guess, like traditional therapy, where you're like making deep eye contact and you're having to be very vulnerable and just talk. He is a really good talker, so I think he could do that in therapy. Yeah. And I wonder if it would be less intimidating for him to do something environmentally where it's a little bit more organic feeling. You're also making less eye contact, and it's a little less intense socially. And so it can feel a little bit more like you're having a conversation and not so much like you're being interrogated by an adult. And it would be, I think, a better way to build rapport with him. So those are kind of like my 2 cents about how I would go about establishing therapy with Oskar. And then I probably check in with Mom now and then, but also I think encourage her. It would be really hard if I was a therapist and I knew, if Mom told me he was going on these like little journeys, I think I would have to take my cortisol levels would be really intense.
Chill the fuck out.
And so I think I really appreciate Mom's courage and letting him do that. And she's really taking, it's very selfless thing as well. And so, yeah, those are just kind of my 2 cents on my thoughts treatment wise.
I would like to first acknowledge, Brittany, your point is amazing. Second, I'd like to just, for levity's purpose, notice that Hannah made it through almost the entire episode without saying fuck until now.
Good job. Holy shit, really?
Yeah.
That's crazy. That doesn't usually happen.
I know. So my apologies. So whoever's going to go next, please go ahead. I feel I need to point that out.
The swear jar is
totally makes sense.
It was empty. We can't donate to charity this time.
Yeah, exactly. I think what I was thinking about what you were saying, Brittany, in terms of the selfless act of the mother, I think one of the other things that I just haven't pointed out yet or talked about yet, so I'm going to talk about it quick and then talk about what I think I would do, maybe, is how she doesn't expect Oskar to be able to deal with where she is emotionally. Whether or not she is able to not cry in front of him or to not show the physical signs of anxiety, that is something that helps give him a chance to come to a place on his own versus feeling like he has to take care of her. Mm-hmm. And I think that is one of the things that is so selfless about the way that she kind of helps him really come to his own conclusion in terms of grief. There really isn't, in my opinion, there aren't a lot better ways than what she does in this film, which is letting him come to his own, to where he needs to come to. She creates a space with which he can be successful and be safe, and doesn't ask him every day, what did you do? And doesn't try to kind of insinuate what's going on, and really allows him to come to her naturally, which makes a huge difference. It's the same idea as a kid being forced to come to therapy versus a kid saying, I really think I really want to talk to somebody about this, which also doesn't really fucking happen. Most of the time it's the parents, but just the difference between doing that and how kind of, Brittany, what you were talking about in terms of building rapport. I'm kind of thinking about working with the mom and Oskar. So helping them maybe create because the other thing that's really hard about this tragedy that they experience of 9/11 is that they don't have a body. And maybe they, whether or not they feel comfortable going to the site of 9/11 to kind of focus their grief there, like on the anniversary of something, or how we know that people can sometimes create yearly rituals that they do when someone dies, that this is something that's so different because there may not be a physical place to do that besides where it happened. And that may be too traumatic to go to. So I would want to, and also it would depend on how they're coming to me, but I feel like having them kind of come and really talk about, how do we want to hold dad in our life now? And is there something silly that we want to do once a week or once a month because dad was so silly and he loved to do this so much? And how could they together kind of create something that felt like it matched how they felt about him together? Because I think the way that they both felt about him, while it's different in terms of being a partner and a dad, it seems very similar. The way that they felt about him. And so I feel like helping them continue to kind of grow that narrative with each other to help to continue to kind of build their family in a different way now that their family has changed forever.
I wonder a little bit about whether or not he'd accept that, because it seems like that's like putting the empty coffin in the ground. He's that kid who comes into therapy who will not have anything to do with the kinds of activities that you would invite him to do in play therapy. And so, he gives you that message that, no, we're going to do non-directive play therapy. That's just it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
absolutely.
he's going to, and I think in that respect, maybe as long as he's got movement in therapy, as long as something is happening, then it's okay to let him run that show. Yeah. Because it seems like whatever. Yeah.
I was thinking about even a situation where he's the expert about something. and just having, and the difference that would have in terms of him being able to explain something or give him a chance to do that versus kind of being like, this is what we're going to do. This is what I think we should be doing. And kind of help them create their own version of what will work, which is, again, another example of meeting people where they are. Which is such a important, the most important part about being a therapist is meeting people where they are.
The big challenge, right, of
Absolutely.
being a pediatric therapist, to do that when the person a lot of times just can't communicate in words or language.
Yeah, absolutely.
Has to play it out with you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah,
I'm done.
Okay. I'll go. I'm going to lean on my experience doing exactly what I'm about to talk about plus, now 12 years since when I worked at the orthogenic school at the University of Chicago with these kids is the thing that I would do is I'm going to get weird. I'm going to lean into what I'm going to get weird. I'm completely comfortable. This will fit my ENFP personality type of like, let's just fucking do stuff. Because so much of therapy that has been developed has shown that over and over, if you can form a relationship, that is where you can make an impact, especially when you're working with neurodivergent kids that have had trauma. Is a relational approach is going to be one of the most impactful things that you can create. And what I want to do is work within the structure of the types of things he already does to make meaning and build mom into that. So I don't know if that's creating a role-playing game or creating a map or creating a new type of puzzle that gets him out into the community again, but something that leads to the revealing of him and mom both revealing secrets together, but having to go through solving puzzles together to get there, which is exactly the way dad built things for him and the way mom set things up for him. And I think leaning into that, which we've already seen to be very effective, would be something that I would want to work closely with mom to set up and create a way of how do we operate within this type of structure of creating a game out of it that he's going to buy into, that we can lock him into, to work on him and mom being able to talk to each other about what things they went through individually and how, whether it's through characters in a story or through clues, they have to solve what they've been hiding from each other. And I think that would be, I don't know exactly how I do it. It would take some time and some figuring out, but I think my instinct would be to go for that kind of approach, to just join him in his way of understanding the world and using what's already proven to work with him and tying in my therapeutic skills to facilitate conversation from there through that medium would be exactly the way I would go.
I mean, I guess I'll jump in next. I was going to take just a different approach to the idea of treatment, which is sort of what I would do with the story narratively, which maybe is rich, coming from the fact that this is Eric Roth who wrote this, and he's sort of like a screenwriting god. But to just make it short and sweet, I would rather this story be unpacked and just unpack the story. And see a lot more than what is given. I think when it was made, limited series were not as popular as they are today. And I could see this thing being 6 or 8 episodes because I would love to be far more with Oskar and his journey and meeting each of these individual people who are dealing with grief and those who help him along the way with the different Black families that he meets. But also there's the disappearing grandmother. I really want to know more about her. And of course the mom, I feel like she's not, they don't do her justice the way they could, and the hero that she is, because in a movie they sort of sacrifice all of that for a twist ending. So they want it to be this big third act reveal that she knew all along, and I see such an opportunity to sort of explore the challenges of connecting with a child on the autism spectrum disorder and figuring these things out, and the isolation that maybe grief also has for her, as well as the family in general with dealing with Oskar's sort of unique way of thinking. So anyways, I would love to just expand this story a lot more and cover all the different sides rather than being so narrowly focused, as well as see more of how he interacts with the world and how the steps that his father has given him before his father died are brought into being in this journey.
I think that would have been amazing to do this like Mayor of Easttown style, where like they could really dig deep into all the things and let all of the things come together in the end, and let all these pieces that, 2.5 hours or 2:15, whatever this was, it didn't quite feel like enough in those montage moments you did. Well, didn't cheapen the experience, did feel like opportunities to go much deeper.
Yeah, it felt like, as I know sometimes happens, it was like they're rushing through the book. And so it feels sometimes like you're watching an outline versus watching a movie. And I would just love to let something like this story let it breathe. Who knows? Maybe
Andrew, how much runtime would you say you'd need? How much runtime would you ask for if you were approaching and pitching this?
I literally have just been having this discussion with someone about 6 to 8 episodes, the difference between 6 episodes and 8 episodes. And I would say something like this, I think would be like 6 or 7 episodes, I think would do it. I think if you drag it on with 10, you're sort of trying to fill time, versus you can still have the sort of impulsion that this movie has of, will he find the key fitting? But I think there's only so much allowance you can give an audience to be like, okay, we're on hour 7 now. Like, I want to, there's 3 more hours of this. Yeah. Anyways, that's just it, putting on a narrative hat, how I would approach my thinking towards it. So.
And we love having your perspective because, we only have the psych perspective, and you have made and written movies. So it's fantastic to have that perspective to add.
Oh, thank you. Well, the nothing on the screen yet. You get so close, and I did do a book adaptation, which I still would love. I mean, obviously, would love to have it be made, and it would be so perfect for these discussions here. But
keep you in our thoughts
and prayers.
Yeah.
No, we know those don't work, Andrew. Not that prayers don't work, but thoughts and prayers together. That's that combination.
Oh yeah, magic.
Right. But what about you, Dr. Paltin? What do you think would be a good approach here?
So I did child therapy for a lot of years, and I always found that, especially with kids, and I should fully disclose, I was in child therapy when I was about 10 years old too. And I was one of those kids that folded its arms and didn't say a word and thought, well, my parents have dragged me here. Oh, hey.
Samesies.
Yeah, many of us. But, so there's this sense of what you focus on, right? Either you can try and kind of walk a kid down a certain path toward healing that you feel like, if this kid goes down this path, he'll be better off or something like that. But I don't know. I never found that really worked with kids that knew where they needed to go. And he seems to be that type of child to me. And so as I would see it, if it were in terms of like, what would we actually do? I'd be focused on the centrality of the relationship in the play therapy. In the movie, I think the grandfather did that by establishing that way they communicated. To me, that was a really good representation of honoring centrality or honoring connection. And meeting a child with what a child can tolerate. I think anything more of trying to have him talk about particular things or whatever, he'd just push back and, you'd be wasting a lot of time. But in terms of what, would be created in therapy, or what would be the healing content, I don't think there'd be much difficulty getting him to, or having to somehow steer him toward those kinds of crafts and activities he was already doing. So I think archivally, you end up after a play therapy with a lot of drawings and a lot of, finger paintings and a lot of sand tray pictures and things like that. And I think with Oskar, you'd end up with a lot of the archival stuff that he had, those little devices made out of paper and the flipping up maps and the things like that. He'd be doing that exact same thing if you gave him the right space. And that would be his, like I mentioned before, I think as long as he was moving, as long as he's, wandering around the territory and checking back in with you when you check in with him, that it's okay to be non-directive. It's okay to trust his lead.
Yeah, I think his mom would be kind of piggyback on that. I think his mom, obviously, she would be on board for this because she's letting him go on these adventures. But I think with a lot of parents, I would probably want to give a caveat of kind of what that looks like. It might look like we're not doing therapy. It might sound like we're just like making like weird books together or like playing together, or why are we talking about, I don't know, like the aviation pattern of birds for like the past like 6 weeks. And so like really trying to get the parents also to understand that it might not look therapeutic from the outside because we're focusing on what you're bringing up, which is like the relationship building and letting him lead and that kind of thing, which can be a slow going process.
It's hard because sometimes we'll give up on that process or on that attempt to communicate with the parents, and we'll just kind of move in the direction of behavioral therapy because it seems to be what parents want is for change to happen, concrete change. But it's a big mistake in a lot of instances.
Huge.
Because you're forcing what we've been talking about, which is you're forcing an agenda on the kid in question.
Well, and you're just another adult who doesn't get it. You're just another person who's trying to make them do something they don't want to do. So I give that speech to every parent that if they want me to see their kid, I said, so here's the deal. We're not gonna be able to make any change if they don't trust me, and they're not gonna trust me for a while. And there's nothing you can do about that. And so I just need you to know that it's going to take some time because they have to trust me, and we have to find a connection before we do anything else.
Right.
And I've had some people say they're okay with that, and then like after like 2 months, they're like,
we're not talking about the thing yet.
Why is this still happening? And it's like, that's because, remember, I told you it's going to take some time, and it's going to take as long as it takes.
Yep. And like getting to the point where that's clear to parents is really hard because like the message that I deliver is a little bit different, but it's the same because you're dead on, is that the more I'm on your agenda and the less I'm on theirs, or the more I'm on their team, or the more I'm on your team and not on their team, the less they're going to talk to me.
Yeah. Because then I'm just their parents' therapist.
It's not like 10 other people have not tried to fix behavior before they've come to you.
Yeah.
Right. Because you're not fixing the behavior. You're helping build a relationship to establish trust and connection that the child is invested in and feels safe talking to you. And especially with, a child like Oskar, it's going to take extra work, extra time, and extra creativity to let him take the lead and let you into his world because you don't understand the world he does. And that's okay. But you have to let him show you and guide you, and you have to be vulnerable enough and take yourself out of the expert chair to use your expert skills to build a relationship with him, to let him take you there, because you can't get there any other way. Yeah.
And I mean, I think his relationship with the renter, like and for a grandpa, is kind of a therapeutic relationship in the sense that it does seem like he's been waiting for like an uninvolved third party to barf all of his feelings to. And you could be that person as a therapist, which could mean that he might do really well in therapy. And he chose his grandpa to barf onto, which is the difference. Like a therapist would feel like they were chosen by their parents. And so also I think you'd have to do a lot of work to remind him or like reiterate to him like confidentiality and like, even though you're a kid, like I'm not going to be running over to your mom and like telling her your secrets and, and really, and he has to choose to trust that or not. Like he might never choose to trust that of you. And I think like that would have to probably be reiterated a lot to him, and it would be like a crapshoot if he would believe that or not.
Well, I just feel like that's something that I always say to kids. I say, so here's the thing. I'm not going to share anything with your parents that you don't know about already. If this is something that you're experiencing, I have to tell them. But you'll know that I have to tell them because I'm going to tell you. Yeah. To try to help them understand that there isn't anything that I'm going to say to them that you and me haven't talked about. Because that's not fair. And it doesn't feel good. Like it feels, kids already feel like adults are giving secrets to each other 1,000% of the time. Like to have somebody I'm supposed to come and sit down in front of, like you have to give them that, which is why one of the other things I say to parents when I give them that same speech is I want them, if they need to in the future, feel comfortable seeing a therapist. Instead of what I usually get, which is people in between the ages of 30 and 50 who come in and say they had one horrible experience with some therapist when they were a kid and didn't come back because it was so bad. I want them to understand that therapy can be shaped to how they are, and also that if they want to utilize it again later in their life, that they at least have an experience where someone was willing to just listen and just do whatever worked in the moment.
That's what I figured out about becoming a therapist is that I had to fix all the bad therapy I had when I was a kid growing up, right? So
Yep.
Well, and I also feel like, the Hannah that had the first client where there was parents and a kid, like I didn't give that speech because I had no fucking idea. So now it's like, I have the speech already, and I'm ready to say that to parents because it's something that they really need to hear, and they need to hear it in black and white, and they need to hear it right away.
They do. They need to hear it like we need to know that Batman's parents were killed in every story we see about Batman.
Ben, you almost got away with it, you motherfucker. All right. So speaking, going into final thoughts, how about you can go first, Ben?
I know, I'll go first. So, I know we haven't talked about them at all throughout the rest of the story, but Viola Davis and Jeffrey Wright's acting in this was also phenomenal. And I feel like Jeffrey Wright was the closest to a therapist we saw in the film besides Grandpa. He was the most emotionally available and empathetic and connected person. And I think seeing his reaction and allowing Oskar to be forgiven, we hear Oskar say that means more to me than, I can even tell you. And I think just this whole movie caught me off guard with how good it was. I know it was Oscar nominated in several categories and won awards, but I hadn't seen it before. And watching this film was just an incredible experience. And I hope that if anybody's listening to this without seeing this film, sometimes people do that, is that go back and watch this. This is an amazing depiction of watching someone work their way through trauma and grief while also showing a really good depiction of what someone who is living with ASD might present as without sugarcoating it or without creating a novelty out of him too much. I think that so much of this film was just beautifully done, and the way that they packaged the story and only reveal bit by bit at a time as he starts working through the grief, as he starts going through the things, was just an absolute master of a film. I agree with Andrew's point earlier that would this have been done a few years later and streaming services been available, that this would have been an even better limited series. I totally agree. But that what we got out of this film was an amazing journey through this. And we saw so many therapeutic elements worked through, including exposure therapy, where we see him have to tell his story to all of the Black families that he meets. He interviews every single person with the last name Black in the city, and having to tell that story over and over of my dad died is how we get through trauma, by building resilience, by recognizing we can tell the story without living in the moment again and without breaking. And that he gains that by telling the story over and over again. And just the way they work through all of these aspects of secret keeping and guilt and shame and sorrow and trauma is amazing. And I really, really like this film. And I hope that everyone who hasn't watched it watches it.
All right, I can go. I can go next. I also was really surprised. I hadn't seen this movie just because I really thought it was a very different kind of movie. I really thought it was like a straightforward drama about like 9/11 and this kid that, and I was 16 when 9/11 happened. So I was just like, wah. Like it just never appealed to me to like revisit that in movie form. And so I was really pleasantly surprised that it was a much more whimsical and childlike movie. Like it reminded me of like Amelie and A Monster Calls, and both movies about someone who is a little different, trying to figure out the world in a very different way than normal, and quote unquote normal. And so I was really kind of like bemused and like tickled by this movie a lot more than I thought from like jump. And as like a child therapist, I really loved it. I say if you like this movie, I would say definitely watch Monster Calls. Monster Calls will rip your soul out of your chest and show it to you, though. Like probably the closest I've ever gotten to like hysterical crying in a public space when I saw that in the theaters. But I think also a good showing of grief through the eyes of a kid. But yeah, I really like this movie. It took me by surprise, and I'll definitely watch it again. Hannah?
Well, I was going to say to Andrew or David, you guys can go ahead. I'll go last.
Sure. I'll jump in. I'll go really fast. Because I was going to say A Monster Calls. I didn't even think of that. That is such a perfect comparison. And I love that movie. A great script too. Read that one. That was one of the few scripts I cried reading a script.
Okay.
But I have to, I would say this film, the first time I saw it, it wasn't as memorable for me as this time. And of course I was watching it through the lens of our discussion. But also, in the intervening years, I also lost my father. So I think there's that element to me coming to see this. I feel like I know this movie got kind of a lot of got panned and had some bad critical reviews at the time. But I think over the years, looking back on it, I think time will sort of see it in a new light. I think a lot of the sort of idea that was too close to 9/11, and maybe some of the ideas that there was a little bit of melodrama in it, I think sort of fades away when you really sort of see what it is, which is this one boy and his processing this enormous grief from multiple fronts through the lens of autism spectrum disorder and this potential Asperger's diagnosis. And I loved it. And I'll just say, just not to harp on the point of my limited series version of it, but I could totally, but I'm going to, but I could totally see, every episode being being framed around a different person that he meets, because I think each one of those individual stories were also worthy of being told, which to me is like high praise when I say I want more of something. So I thought and the acting as well was just phenomenal.
Yeah, I feel the same way as you guys on a lot of these things. I guess the only thing I want to add is that I really did appreciate the messy parts of it. And I'm not sure that, America could tolerate more, in a way, just because it was so difficult. And we tend to have that avoidance of things that are way too deep to go into, and those really, really heavy questions. It didn't avoid those questions, and it went right there. Especially with some of the imagery and themes that were brought up. So that really, I really appreciated that about the film. And then as a parent of somebody who's on the spectrum, I can completely relate to Tom Hanks's feeling of, someday this child will be in the earth without me, and I need to really figure out how to make that okay, both for him and for me. So that's it.
Thank you so much for interesting to hear both of you have to say. I think I saw this movie in the movie theater when it came out, and I have never watched it again because it destroyed me. I was 19 when September, when it happened, and going to the movie theater and really had that feeling of it's too soon. Like, I'm not ready to see something that's so clear, paints such a clear picture of the trauma of that day. So I didn't rewatch it and only remembered how sad I was and how hard I cried. Like, I think my shirt was wet by the end of the movie. I'm also a huge crier. If you guys hadn't figured that out yet, I cry about everything. So, but I think what was really nice about seeing it this time is that it really, because I think in some ways it's been far enough away that it feels a little bit different. And watching it feels so much more important to watch the grief and to watch anything that feels genuine from a kid's point of view, just in general, no matter what it's about, always feels really good because I feel like they have voices that often get drowned out by adults on such a regular basis. So I really loved this movie. I probably will watch it again. And actually, oddly enough, I have the book and just haven't read it yet. So I'm definitely going to read the book because now I want to know everything. And I want to see what they changed.
I will definitely say that between this and Everything is Illuminated, which is another movie that I love by the same author, like, I can't believe I haven't read and either of those books or other books yet, because I think what I love so much about this movie too was the language, like the way he would simply say, like, I love that. And like all of like just a little, like I said, I wrote down a lot of quotes and I never write like down that many quotes. So yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again to Andrew Rubin and Dr. David Paltin from joining us. And like, once again, if you could let people know where they can find you or find Symptom Media.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone, if they're interested, they can go to symptommedia.com, take a look at some of our preview films, subscribe if they would like. We also have our library is used in a lot of universities for teaching. And just the process that we have been doing here, which is really interesting, is the process that we do in Symptom Media, but on the other side of the creative side, on the creative side versus the analysis side. So it's just kind of interesting seeing that sort of the mirror inverse of that. So a lot of these discussions is what then goes into making the films that we put out, that then someone like Dr. Paltin goes and helps then analyze and bring it back to people in that sort of educational way. So anyways, symptommedia.com.
Great.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for me, you can get in touch with me through Andrew at Symptom Media. I'm sure you passed along the message, right? Or I'm in Orange, California. It's where my home base that I teach from, even though I teach different places and have my practice from. So that's at docpaltin@yahoo.com, DOCPALTIN @yahoo.
Great. And as always, you can find us on Twitter at popcorn_psych. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook at popcorn psychology. You can also email us at popcornpsychology@gmail.com. That's the best place to find us if you want to have in-depth discussions about or questions you have about an episode you've watched or recommendations for movies. But yeah, it was happy talking with everybody and have a good day.